there's no absolute wins on this by either side. Where do you reach the point where avoiding a full re-escalation of the war is not in the U.S. interest and not in the Iranian interest? So when do they blink and come to their senses and say, all right, we've got to put this thing back on track. We veered off course, and let's at least keep this gray zone between neither war nor peace, and let's try to see what we can do to extend that forward and work it out. I think
Welcome back to the Heroes Path Dispatch. I'm Colonel John Fenswick. 1 week ago tonight, we sat here talking about a fragile ceasefire in a country celebrating its 250th birthday under storm clouds. Well, this week, the storm broke. Iranian missiles hit tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. American bombs answered about 175 targets in 2 nights. Iran struck back at our bases in 3 Gulf countries. The president declared that the peace deal was over. And this is the part that we should all hold on to. Tonight, as we record this, the Vice President and the Secretary of State are in Oman, sitting back down at the table. So here you are, not at war, not peace, something in between, and your gas prices, your mortgage, and possibly your kids in uniform are all riding on which way this all tips. So one housekeeping note before we start, as I was thinking about this and how we go about this dispatch every week from tonight forward, and we've been doing this in the past too, but every story on this dispatch is going to end with 2 questions that we're going to ask out loud. We're going to ask the so what, why does this touch your life? And then now what actually happens next and what should you watch for? Because if a story can't survive those 2 questions, it really doesn't belong on this show. That might belong somewhere else. But to walk this week with me, as always, the man who keeps us honest and informed, Jeff Steinberg. Jeff, welcome back.
Thanks, John. Great to be back.
We got a lot to unpack, and we're going to try to keep this short. Before the main event, let's talk about all those things that do need to be unpacked, and we'll talk about them quickly. 7 stories fast. We'll start at home in Missouri because Mother Nature had an absolutely brutal week last week. Let's talk about Missouri's 1,000-year flood and then the deadly heat wave before it.
I think the framework for looking at this is the every second year report that's issued by the American Society of Civil Engineers. And they've pointed out for years and years that there is a severe deficit in maintenance and investment in the country's basic infrastructure. They estimate $2 to $5 trillion just to maintain our current water management systems, our roads, our tunnels, our bridges, our power grid. And so really, yes, there was a 1,000-year event, but people may remember back during the Bush administration, Katrina, where it was known that eventually there was going to be a 100-year level 5 hurricane in that part of the country. And rather than investing before it happened, it took the calamity of Katrina for the investment to finally come through. And then the Army Corps of Engineers did a great job of building up the necessary water control systems. But it was after the fact. And this Missouri situation reminds me that we still haven't learned the lessons that if you're unwilling to invest in critical infrastructure, then you're going to be hit with these things because that's nature. And we're in a period where climate is clearly changing. And if you're not willing to invest to be prepared for that, you're going to be hit with catastrophes. And the cost afterwards is going to be much, much higher in both costs and, of course, in all of the human lives that are lost and infrastructure destroyed, homes and people's lives completely upended.
Yeah. Washington, D.C., this whole area, and I happen to be down in your area, and it was quite a bit cooler down there. They told me, hey, come down to Florida and cool down.
Exactly.
There you are. Up here, I'm in Annapolis now, but 103 degrees. And it felt a lot hotter, actually. It felt like 115 degrees on the 4th of July. And then the water, starting on Thursday in southeast Missouri, they took more than 12 inches of rain. And that's the 1,000-year piece that all the forecasters were talking about. So you had flash flood emergencies, a state of emergency from Governor Kehoe, and more than 350 people rescued, including, I believe it was around 40 that were stranded at a lodge on the Black River. And campers were climbing trees just to survive. One woman was found dead on Saturday, and some 40 million people remain under flood threat into next week from the Ohio Valley eastward.
Right. And we know what needs to be done. And we had that little blip during the Biden administration of that bipartisan infrastructure bill that basically did a little bit. It's better than nothing, but that should have been the opening shot of an expanded investment. The lists exist in the governor's offices. The Corps of Engineers knows it, and we're just not willing to invest in that kind of infrastructure investment to at least do minimum damage when these things inevitably are going to happen.
It all comes down to leadership, and there's a real lack of it right now. So let's talk about the second issue. In Maine, the Democrats' marquee recruit imploded. You want to talk a little bit about Graham Plattner?
I think that some Democrats are basically saying we stand a better chance now of defeating Susan Collins if we can come up with a candidate who is not the most vulnerable and easiest target for pot shots for Collins. Collins is considered too old. She's not part of the administration's list of favorite Republicans, and she's clearly identified as the single most vulnerable Republican seeking re-election for the Senate. And so I'm waiting to see what kind of process plays out. The Democrats are convening basically caucus meetings in every congressional district, and they're going to come up with an actual, quote, democratic process for choosing a candidate. Many Democrats are saying if we had done this rather than coronate Kamala Harris as the nominee after Biden dropped out, maybe we would not have lost to Donald Trump in 2024. I'm holding my breath waiting to see. The voters chose. There's clearly an insurgent mood in the country, and he just became such damaged goods after the Politico story came out.
Yeah.
And so I think the net effect, if they play this thing the right way, they could come up with a viable candidate who's got to appeal to Plattner's core base of support. So you're not going to choose some sort of mainstream, centrist, conservative Democrat there to try to look more like Susan Collins than Susan Collins does these days.
Well, Jeff, it's interesting because the Democrats, they need 4 seats to take the Senate. And
Correct.
The consensus from the analysts is that there's virtually no path that doesn't run through that state. Maine and the Democrats now have to find that replacement that you're talking about. So
I'm sure somebody on the Democratic Party side went to Politico with that story to make sure that they didn't preemptively blow the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, let's talk about this third issue, Venezuela. They're counting the dead. They're opening the wells. The earthquake toll from June is now past 3,500 dead, with thousands still missing. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
Mother Nature has a way of being the kind of great leveler. I think that there was a piece in the New York Times a couple of days ago really going through the details of just how much Secretary of State Rubio is functioning as of Venezuela, on the phone continuously with the acting President Dulce Rodriguez, managing the bank accounts for the country. And in this case, the U.S. did respond pretty rapidly with a fairly large amount of personnel, military personnel sent on the ground, people who have expertise. Checks were cut right away for some of the disaster relief. So it's ironic that the very infrastructure that Russell voted OMB and, of course, the Doge team under Elon Musk had dismantled had to be put back together on an emergency basis in order to deal with the crisis in Venezuela. So it's loaded with ironies in multiple directions and human tragedy.
Yeah, and also this week, the post-Maduro government did something that the Venezuelan government has done a generation. It broke the state oil monopoly. And you had new regulations that were published on later this past week, and it opened the oil sector to private and foreign operators. And so now you've got wildcatters pouring in.
Again, it's all running through Marco Rubio's desk.
Yeah.
And they're basically making it clear not only that Russia and China are not welcome, but that the Europeans are not welcome. This is going to be a carve-out for U.S. oil companies. Chevron never left. And one of the top officials of Chevron, who was essentially one of the coordinators of the whole recruitment of those people who facilitated the capture of Maduro and his wife. So Chevron is on the ground, never left. They're in a unique and critical position. And the other U.S. major oils are coming in there now. This incident, earthquake, may slow down their enthusiasm a bit, but this is now an American proprietary.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about this fourth issue that's faced us this past week. Hamas handed over Gaza, at least on paper, on Monday. They formally dissolved the Gaza government that ended nearly 19 years of rule to hand civilian administration to, for lack of a better term, a technocratic committee under an internationally supervised board of peace. So what's your take on that?
Let's see how this board of peace operation is able to put something together.
Yeah.
Hamas, as a political and military organization, has not disarmed and not left the scene. In a certain sense, they're basically giving this board of peace an opportunity to either succeed, or in the wake of its failure, they'll be back. They'll be back more popular and more powerful than ever. But I'm sure that some of the Gulf Arab countries that Hamas depends upon for support, Qatar in particular, is playing a certain role in trying to at least give President Trump enough rope to either succeed or hang himself over this whole Gaza business. And it's certainly better than a situation that justifies the continuing expanded Israeli occupation.
Yeah.
Israel's planning to carve out control over 70% of Gaza. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, the hardline ministers in the Netanyahu cabinet, are pushing aggressively for the resumption of settlements being built in the northern part of Gaza. And even though the international spotlight has shifted more towards the Straits of Hormuz and Iran, that Gaza situation still remains extremely fragile and uncertain. And so I think if Hamas had removed some of the immediate justification that Israel's using for effectively annexation of much of Gaza, we'll have to watch carefully and see where it goes.
Jeff, the fifth issue that we were talking about, and this was fascinating. On Monday, while the world watched the Gulf and everything that was happening in Iran, a Chinese submarine launched a ballistic missile into the South Pacific. And that was China's first publicly reported submarine-launched ballistic missile since 1982. So here we are 44 years later. It wasn't a subtle message at all, because as we're consumed with Iran, Beijing demonstrated it can strike underwater at intercontinental range. It's not a subtle message at all.
Exactly.
Add the Chinese Coast Guard's permanent patrols around Taiwan, squeezing what we covered 2 weeks ago, Beijing's export ban on our biggest rare earth companies. There's a trend here that I think we all have to watch. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that the Chinese are very good at staking out positions to maximize their negotiating leverage. You've got the Xi Jinping trip still, as far as I know, scheduled to take place. And there are other meetings where Trump and Xi Jinping are going to be present together. One in Miami, the G20, another one, I believe, later in the year, the APEC summit meeting taking place in Japan, and in China. So I think you've got the Chinese playing, as they always do, hardball, and just so that nobody is caught missing the obvious, they're doing the obvious. They're launching their weapons capability. They've been developing an asymmetric warfare capability, certainly not attempting to match us dollar for dollar, but developing systems that are part of a strategic deterrence. And their main strategy, including vis-a-vis Taiwan, has been area denial, anti-access. And so they've invested in the weapon systems that give them that. And the Chinese, by developing this submarine launch, are giving a clear reminder that they're not just simply a regional major military power, but that they've got global reach if they were to become engaged in a direct conflict with the U.S. I don't think they want that, but I think they're flexing their muscle because there's going to be a lot of negotiating over the course of the remainder of this year on a bilateral basis at the very top between China and the United States, and especially with the U.S. distracted with NATO issues and issues related to the continuing Iran situation. Ask the Chinese to, oh, by the way, remember us.
Yeah. Well, I think there's definitely that connectivity that you mentioned, especially with regard to the summit and all the other events that are going to be coming up. Let's talk about this fastest growing Ebola outbreak ever recorded in the Eastern Congo. The World Health Organization is fighting what it calls the fastest growing Ebola outbreak on record. You had more than 1,700 cases and over 600 dead. And those cases are spilling over from Iraq into Uganda. And so this is the first 6 weeks of the outbreak, and it's produced roughly 60% more confirmed cases than we saw in 2014.
Yeah. And I think, again, the question becomes, they know what to do. The World Health officials know the kinds of emergency measures and resources that have to be thrown at something like this so it doesn't become another global pandemic as we saw with COVID. And so, again, I keep going back to the first several months of the Trump administration, the dismantling of USAID, the mandate to put a freeze on all previously authorized funding for foreign policy initiatives. Most of the U.S. foreign policy initiatives involve these kinds of support programs, particularly in the public health area. And I haven't looked deep enough to know exactly how much of a shortage there are in resources globally to throw into this. But
well, Jeff, let's talk about the last issue, and that's the first ransomware attack that's run entirely by artificial intelligence. You have these security researchers at SysTig. They documented something that I think every business owner, and quite honestly, every family with a computer should file away. And it's the first ransomware operation carried out end-to-end by an artificial intelligence agent. So no human at the keyboard at all. They're calling it Jade Puffer. We've always heard that the potential for misusing AI is out there, that it's capable of something perhaps potentially destructive. And this is, to my knowledge, is the first time that we've seen something that is autonomous and dangerous and is operating on its own.
After the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it created the context. It took years, really decades, but ultimately world leaders came to realize that there had to be a framework for governing these technologies, and the potential for AI, this kind of self-generating ransomware, is something that's going to have to be subjected to a kind of disarmament regulatory framework. And that's going to be even more challenging than nuclear, because at least in the case of nuclear, sovereign governments have the monopoly, they at least have up until this moment, on the ownership and deployment of nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. Here we've got the greatest added complication that we're also dealing with private sector actors, not all necessarily responsible actors, who could see getting their hands on this technology being greater than having a suitcase nuke, which used to be the greatest fear, quote unquote, in terms of terrorist criminal organizations and the rest. And we're behind the eight ball on this in a really big way. And again, it's something that the responsible world powers are going to have to take up. In a certain sense, this public revelation that just occurred in the last few days will hopefully be the wake-up call that forces governments to get past the complete entropy that we've been witnessing on this issue for years, really almost decades.
Yeah, no question. That arms race that we've talked about between nations now is a version that's running quietly behind the scenes between machines and the rest of us.
How do you even know whether a nuclear launch detection is real or some sort of a AI-generated spoof?
Yeah, that's the one thing that scares the daylights out of me when you think about the potential for this and how do you tell if it's a spoof or not.
Yeah.
So, Jeff, let's get into the main event. Last Sunday, we told our audience that the Iran ceasefire was not war, it wasn't peace. It's a fragile in-between that could tip either way. This week, it tipped. Walk us through that day by day, because I think the sequence matters in all of this.
The Iranians' interpretation of the Memorandum of Understanding, there would be traffic flowing freely, but that they would have a certain control over it. And when those ships moved towards the southern pathway, the Omani pathway, rather than the Iranian pathway, they fired on it. The Iranian foreign minister, Araghchi, told a number of Gulf leaders who he was meeting with several days after the incident that it was a mistake. And I don't know whether he's saying that this was rogue factions within the IRGC that took it upon themselves, the decentralized chain of command that enabled them to survive after the attacks against their central command structures is still in place. And clearly there's significant factional differences within there. And of course, these events occurred against the backdrop of the funeral of the late Supreme Leader Khamenei. I think it's important to bear in mind that the Iranian attack against the ships moving through the southern straits, the U.S. attacks, the Iranian retaliation, all of these things, even Trump's statements about the MOU is over, the next day he said, but there's still the possibility of a bigger deal than just the MOU.
Well,
so I think
but Jeff, the core dispute is Article 5 of that MOU. Iran claims the right to control and even charge tolls on the passage through the strait. But the U.S. position is the strait stays open to everybody, full stop.
And of course, I think I might have mentioned this previously. Thomas Pickering, a retired, very senior and respected American diplomat, wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs 3 weeks ago. And he said, look, the problem is the word tolls. He says, there's ways around that. There are service fees, which the Omanis and the Iranians are discussing. There's ways that you could do this. But the Omanis made clear yesterday, and this is the context in which you've got Vice President Vance and Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, really, Rubio there, is that Oman rejects the idea of funds being sequestered from tolls to be used as a reconstruction fund. So there's a lot of nuances of language. The big problem to bear in mind is that we're already almost 30 days into the 60 days that we're supposed to be operating under the MOU. Obviously, that whole time frame can be extended, but I think these events just really highlight how precisely accurate we were a week ago when we said it's neither war nor peace. Both sides have a vested interest in the deal going forward. In Trump's case, it's oil prices. And the shutdown of the straits is...
Yeah, and that's key too, because I think it's important to note that Washington's first answer on this wasn't military, it was financial. That same day, Treasury revoked the waiver that had let Iran sell its oil, effective this coming Friday, July 17th. So, I mean, this is like a slow motion train wreck in many respects.
And then the big question is, there's no absolute wins on this by either side. Where do you reach the point where avoiding a full re-escalation of the war, which is something, bear in mind, that the Israelis would very much like to see, is not in the U.S. interest and not in the Iranian interest. So when do they blink and come to their senses and say, all right, we've got to put this thing back on track. We veered off course, and let's at least keep this gray zone between neither war nor peace, and let's try to see what we can do to extend that forward and work it out. I think there's a reasonable chance that's what we're going to see by the end of this week.
Yeah, but you know what? When you have Revolutionary Guard missiles hitting American facilities in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar, that's as close to open war as you can get when both sides are still insisting they're negotiating. So let's talk, Jeff, about the funeral and the son and the plot. You know what I'm talking about.
I mentioned to you just a few minutes ago before we started that the information about an Iranian plot to assassinate President Trump came from the Israelis and not from U.S. intelligence. At least gave me pause. The statements that have come out from Mojtaba Khamenei were threats, no question about it. And how much of that is of necessity for domestic consumption, how much of it translates into operational resources being deployed on something like this, there's a wide gap between that. Both sides really still have to appeal to their domestic audience that they're victorious. But in this case, I've seen no indication that U.S. intelligence has developed a serious threat alert coming from the Iranians vis-a-vis Trump. The Israelis may very well have completely accurate and vetted intelligence on this, but they also have an ulterior motive for wanting to steer Mr. Trump in the direction of agreeing with the Israeli war objective, which is to re-escalate to the point of full and complete regime change.
Yeah. So it's really interesting as well, because I think that it adds another layer onto this, but some of this might have just been piling on, because it is a fact that Khamenei did say this. He said that, you know, the quote, I'm looking at it right now. Let's see. Revenge is the will of our nation. We pledge to avenge your pure blood. So he said it, but was that Israel piling on to this and acting like this is some kind of super double secret, top secret intelligence report? At the end of the day, we killed their head of state. And it's not surprising to me that they're making threats on ours.
And John, and of course, you know from your own vast experience that the intelligence community draws a clear distinction between intelligence and actionable intelligence.
Yeah. Yep.
And the question, is there actionable intelligence here? Is there evidence that there's particular movement, that there's plans? Go back again to the Reagan period when Khomeini was still around. It was the middle of the Iran-Iraq war, and death to Americans after the taking of the hostages in the embassy was the buzzword in Tehran. Death to the Zionist state, death to the Americans, and the U.S. and Israel were covertly providing weapons, missiles, and other things to the Iranians at the same time, so that they could continue to avoid being defeated by Saddam Hussein.
Jeff, let's get to that one kind of question here. For any listener, why do they care about the Article 5 of the memorandum? What's the so what here? Why should any of us really care about this who are standing thousands of miles away, insulated by two oceans?
Within hours of the Iranians firing on those ships, price of oil went up by 6%. People have undoubtedly by now already even seen a kind of a small blip up on gasoline at the pump. And there are so many other elements of the global economy that drive up inflation that are impacted by uncertainty about the opening or closing of the Straits of Hormuz. Fertilizer, agricultural goods, semiconductors, the things that move through there are not just simply oil and oil derivative products. And so the inflation numbers are going to be coming out in the next few days. And so there's really a lot of concern at the household checkbook level for the consequences.
And I'll tell you, those are great points. But there's also a third piece of this, and that is, and I'd actually put this at the top, roughly 40,000 American service members sit in bases in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Qatar, and this week, Iranian missiles landed at all three of those countries. So
correct.
Thankfully, nobody was killed with these last. I think there's one injured from some of the damage. The families of those troops don't need to explain the so what. They get it. They're worried about their loved ones who are deployed abroad.
That's exactly right. And I think the whole continued viability of that forward basing as a cornerstone of maintaining security and safe passage through the Gulf is really up for reevaluation in the aftermath of the 40 days that have already taken place, the 40 actual days of combat. And we may be on the cusp of day 41 going in the direction of a full-blown escalated war.
Yeah, and that really begs a lot of other questions about what Congress is going to do in the wake of that. I think you just answered what happens from here. Does Iran meet the deadline? Do they not? And so I think that for the listener, the single number to watch remains the price on gas, as you had mentioned. You can see them in all the gas station signs, and it's the market's real-time vote on whether all this is working.
Right, exactly right.
Let's talk about this other story, and you said you wanted to talk about that this week, and that is the NATO summit.
Yeah, for all intents and purposes, the meeting took place on a bed of eggshells. Mm-hmm. All of the NATO leaders were walking on eggshells, uncertain about what was going to happen vis-a-vis President Trump. And I think that in the aftermath of the summit, there was a great sort of sigh of relief about some of the things that came out of his mouth. But I think that underlying that, there were deep points of disagreement among many of the NATO countries. And of course, one aspect of it is moving forward. How much is that U.S. commitment to NATO really there? A lot of people were concerned that some of Trump's behavior during the summit meeting suggested that he was not in particularly good physical or psychological health. Yeah, and so that's a worry that transcends whether he said Patriot missiles for Ukraine or not. That was the thing that a lot of the Western media highlighted as the single biggest point. And of course, as you mentioned, there are now renewed oil sanctions on Russia, 500% sanctioned tariffs on any countries buying Russian oil. We don't know whether or not that's a short-term tactical move by Trump, both to placate Europe, but also to try to bring Putin to the table. And the relationship with Zelensky, this whole idea of long-range strikes, which are already happening, the Europeans are already backing that up. The promise that Ukraine can build Patriot missiles, that's a really important thing for the post-war period, because no matter how uniquely capable the Ukrainians have demonstrated themselves to be at figuring out ways to produce the drones and the other equipment that they need, building Patriot missiles is something that's going to require multi-year startup before you actually have them in production. And right now, the U.S. is going to take 6 years to just simply replenish the Patriot missile stocks that have already been burned through between the Ukraine war over those 4 years and the 40-day war with Iran. And we don't know whether we're going into day 41 within the next few hours.
Yeah.
But I think that Europe is moving at least on the idea that NATO may be a European proposition without the United States. And you could say that people put Trump in a better mood than he was at last year's NATO meeting when he was looking for the door as soon as possible. But it's very tenuous. It's very fragile. And
well, but it also, I think it points to an American strategy that's shifting right now from Ukraine our weapons to building Ukraine into an arsenal that defends itself. And I'll tell you, you know for certain that this has landed in Moscow. No question about that.
Right.
I think they reacted to this as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump clearly understands that the war didn't end 24 hours after he was inaugurated and that he's got a problem. He flip-flopped back and forth to sometimes thinking Zelensky's the problem and sometimes that Putin is the problem.
Yeah, I think the most recent quote, I'm looking for it right now. Oh, here it is. He said in sidebar meetings, the president met Zelensky and he said, quote, "We've actually developed a good relationship." That's a long way away from where those two men stood a year ago.
February 2025, exactly.
Yeah. It begs the question, okay, what changed? Why are they such good buddies now?
Yeah, well, also, frankly, also with President Trump, you've got to wonder how long that's going to be the case and find out whether Zelensky, whether he still had his wallet when he left the room.
That's funny. Well, so Jeff, now what? I think that we should all watch is the same place for all the three stories, and that's the Senate floor this coming week. You have what you were talking about last week, the defense authorization bill carrying that $1.5 trillion request that we spent all of the last episode talking about. That hits the floor, doesn't it?
It does. Congress is back in session Monday. Of course, we're in the summer. We're in an election year, a midterm election year. Congress is going to look to do minimal the things that are unavoidable to get done and to be out of town sometime in August.
Yeah.
So we've got a clock ticking on maybe 3-4 week period. They'd certainly like to be back home long before Labor Day. And the NDAA is obviously one of a number of issues. And there's a lot of frustration at the lack of coordination between the Republicans in Congress, particularly the Senate and the White House. The fact that you had this bipartisan housing bill that Republicans wanted to tout as a great victory on behalf of the affordability crisis for Americans, and President Trump let it pass but refused to sign it.
Yeah.
And briefly held it hostage to the SAVE Act.
Yeah. Jeff, let's close this up right now. 3 things to watch. The things that I gathered just listening to you, you've got the sign at the gas station that matters to all of us. You've got an inflation report that's coming out this week, I think on Tuesday. So we're going to need to read that the right way. And then, as you just talked about, the Senate's $1.5 trillion defense bill that they're going to have to talk about. And oh, by the way, 500% Russia sanctions. So all these are interesting, and it's really going to be interesting where it leads in this coming week.
Yeah, and as long as the Iran situation remains completely in limbo, it means that there's very little resources to direct at the other big military situation, which is the Russia-Ukraine one, which I know Trump would like to come up with some sort of a formula to bring that thing to an end. And he just doesn't have the bandwidth right now, nor does Rubio or Vance or anybody else.
Jeff, here's where I'll leave it. That was a week that would have been easy to believe everything was coming apart, tankers burning, the bombers flying, a new supreme leader promising revenge, and then, oh, by the way, floodwaters in the Ozarks. And yet tonight, the negotiators are in Muscat, the checks still cleared, the rescue boats go out to the campers in the trees, the system, it's battered, it's indebted, it's argumentative, but it held for one more week. So our job isn't to tell you everything's fine. It's not, but what we're here to do is to tell you what's true, what it means, the so what of all this, and what comes next, the now what, so that none of it catches you unprepared. But Jeff, thank you as always. And
Pleasure, John.
And to everybody listening, hug your people, watch the pump, and don't let Tuesday's headline fool you. This is Colonel John Fensel. Thank you for walking the path.